Welcome everybody. I'd like to invite you to take your seats so we can get started. So my name is Mina Mojtahedi, and I'm the Disability Inclusion Advisor here at the ICRC, as well as at the IFRC. So welcome. I hope you enjoyed the interesting discussion that we're having this evening. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Stephen Wilkinson, who is the Global International Humanitarian Law Advisor from Diakonia from Sweden.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that on behalf of the Global IHL Centre of Diakonia, that we have an opportunity to be here and share a few words on the project and the photography exhibition in particular. I really would like to take this moment to thank the Geneva Academy for allowing us to partner on this endeavour, and a huge congratulations to the Academy, Alice Priddy and Giles Dooley for all their work, the driving force behind what we're here today for. I will now do my best to share a few words on the photos and the work of Giles Dooley. I must say, as an international lawyer, perhaps my ability to put adequate words to this work is somewhat out of my comfort zone, but also maybe that's the point. Viewing the photos and the accompanying stories is personal, both in regards to the subject, but also for the viewer. For me, the importance of the photos is an important reminder of the fact that those with disabilities are often forgotten, and I reflect on my own personal and my institution's blind spots. But at the same time, those with disabilities should not be considered as victims. They are active agents, and ones that have the same spectrum of rights that we all share. However, largely due to stigma and discrimination, those with disabilities are often denied opportunities for participation and integration. Such issues are further exacerbated during armed conflict, and the photo exhibition looks to provide some of those stories, a lens into what happens in reality. The inability to hear warning sirens due to deafness, mobility limitations to seek shelter from attack. These pictures, taken from the perspective of someone who themselves is disabled, are incredibly powerful and a tool for us to share stories, the experience, to really try to understand as best we can the reality for so many. The pictures capture so many emotions: joy, pain, fear, sadness, and hope. Emotions we all experience. I am hopeful that this photography exhibition reminds us of how much work there is to be done and serves as an inspiration for us to continually reflect, as a humanitarian community in particular, of how we can become the best possible allies for those with disability. This, for me, is a fantastic first step, the project accompanied with the photo exhibition. It is so important that the protections set out under international humanitarian law across the range of issues that IHL looks to address are understood and applied in a manner which is inclusive of the perspective of those with disabilities. An incredibly simple, almost throwaway phrase, but to achieve that, there is so much work to be done. And I believe through collective action of different agencies, academic institutions, we can come together and hopefully improve. I think I'll leave it there, but I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion where I can maybe get back to my comfort zone of the international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So next I would like to invite Marco Sassoli, who is the leading IHL expert and the director of Geneva Academy, as well as professor of international law at the University of Geneva.
Good evening and welcome. I have to say some words about the Geneva Academy, but which are related to so we are a joint center between the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And we do research like this one, but we train also people who become the leaders in the humanitarian world, and I'm very proud that two of them will be in the panel tonight. And I see quite a number of others in the room. I would like to thank the ICRC to host us tonight and to have helped us in our research. I would like to thank Diaconia to have made this research possible, as well as the Swiss Network for International Studies and Pro Victimis for their support at different stages of the project. I have to make tonight a coming out. I just published a book of more than 600 pages about international humanitarian law, and the word disability does not appear there. But it's important that we admit that we learn, and I learned mainly for the time being from this study. There are sections on gender, LGBTIQ people, families of missing persons, human remains, private military and security companies, but I simply didn't think about it. And this is a good symbol for the forgotten, for the fact that people without disabilities, including, but perhaps in particular in armed conflicts, are forgotten. And the reason why I didn't write about it was I was not yet director of the academy and simply not aware of this project. And I ignored, out of mere ignorance, the largest minority of people affected by armed conflicts. And we don't even know how many they are, but we can start from the idea that 15% of all human beings are affected by disabilities, and this must also be the case in armed conflict. And this ignorance is even more shocking because I met people with disabilities in armed conflict when I was more than 20 years ago ICRC delegate in the former Yugoslavia. And this is perhaps, this story has some meaning for us. We visited and we assisted a center where people with mental disabilities, as it was called at that time, were. And when we were there, they were saying things which the translator told us. They said, all these people outside are crazy. And there was indeed fighting outside and so on. And indeed, the question was who was more crazy, those who made the war or those who were inside. Okay. Now that I have turned, for those of you who are Christians, somehow from a Saulus to a St. Paul, I am not saint, but nevertheless, that I'm conscious of the problem. I'm proud that the Geneva Academy has engaged in this pioneering project, and I particularly thank Alice Priddy, who is a senior researcher at the Academy, but to have initiated and completed, that's also important, the project, and she will present it tonight, and she will also thank the many individuals who have contributed in one way or another to it. I think the correct understanding of rights of persons with disabilities is also important for international humanitarian law and public international law more general. You may know that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is one of the few human rights conventions explicitly stating that it applies to armed conflicts. And Mrs. Priddy shows, in my view, correctly, that the correct understanding of the interaction between IHL and the Convention, in particular its requirement of reasonable accommodation to the needs, or rather to the rights of persons with disabilities, makes the difference and allows, or rather requires, that persons with disabilities are no longer forgotten by university professors, but that's not important, while what is more important, by humanitarian agency, and most importantly, the military and armed groups. Now, international humanitarian law has always been flexible enough to take a better understanding in society of the realities of victimization phenomena into account without a need to change the texts. Think about the understanding of the role of women in armed conflicts in 1949 and today. The Geneva Conventions have not been changed. And okay, the additional protocols have some additional rules, but it is mainly because we better understand the situation and the role that things have changed. Now, once people understand, like me now, that there is a forgotten problem, and I would like to add, because of my personal experience, that probably the mentally disabled are the forgotten about the forgotten. Once people understand that there is a problem and that persons with disabilities do not deserve charity or just medical attention, that it is even not just a social or political phenomenon of exclusion, but an issue of rights, the response seems to be obvious. The needs, or better, the rights of persons with disabilities have to be taken into account in armed conflicts, and belligerents and humanitarians have to reasonably accommodate their practice and interpretation of IHL to this reality. I think the study shows that it is not impossible to implement that response, even in an armed conflict, a situation which is by definition a profoundly inhumane situation. If Henri Dunant, here I may speak about Henri Dunant succeeded to achieve protection of wounded soldiers being, as such, part of the military potential of a party on the battlefield, if he succeeded that, we must today, 170 years later, be able, it must be possible to achieve the respect and non-discrimination of persons with disabilities who are nearly all civilians not contributing to the military potential of a party. I think for everyone who has heard this, this seems to be an obvious message, but as always, someone had first to say it. And now our challenge is not just to say it in Geneva, but to translate it into a reality in the field. But you did not come here to hear me, so now I invite the panelists to come forward, aptly moderated by Mida Mojahedi, the Disability Inclusion Advisor of the ICRC. By the way, this is also another sign that the message comes through. In my time, there was no Disability Inclusion Advisor at the ICRC. Thank you so much.
So welcome again. And I just want to mention right from the start, one of the most important things, that we do have an apéro at the end. So before I forget, I want to let you know, so please do stay until the end. But yes, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you, starting with Shahrzad Tajbakhsh next to me, who is the Deputy Director in the Division of International Protection at the UNHCR. And next to Shahrzad is Ezekiel Hefes. Sorry, did I pronounce your name correctly? Great. Who is a thematic legal advisor at Geneva Call. also with experience of working with ICRC in the field. And next to Ezekiel, we have Hugo Slim, who is the head of policy here at the ICRC, and also has extensive experience in research from the University of Oxford, if I understood correctly, leading IHL expert. And then last but certainly not least, Alice Priddy, who is a senior researcher at Geneva Academy and the author of the report that we'll be discussing today. So I'd like to start by inviting Alice to give us a briefing about your research and the interesting findings.
Thank you, Mina. Better? Okay. So thank you very much, Mina, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And thank you, ICRC, for hosting us. I'm going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes just talking with you about the latest Academy briefing, Disability in Armed Conflict. There are copies available outside for those that wish to take one. The briefing is the outcome of 3 years of research that the Academy has been undertaking. And we've benefited greatly from Mina's expertise, who's been so generous in sharing your thoughts with us and reading a draft of the briefing, so thank you, Mina. We've also benefited from the leadership of Professor Andrew Clapham, as well as Anissa Ballal, who's here today from the Academy, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Catalina de Vandas. She was our partner on this project. And we had a number of partners in the field at various locations, conflict settings, all over the world who assisted us throughout this project. So it was really a collaboration. I should start by saying how this project came about, actually, because I think it's maybe a bit insightful. I was looking at sexual violence and armed conflict, which is really my background, and I wanted to look at the interaction between gender and disability. And I started to do some research and found that there was very little to nothing out there on the topic. So then I started to look at disability more generally in armed conflict, and again was surprised to find that there was nothing out there on the topic, which led me to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which at the time I was new to. I must say I myself had largely overlooked it. But the convention, which came into force in 2008, is quite groundbreaking, as Marco himself said, in that it expressly states that it continues to apply in armed conflict and that it applies alongside IHL. So that was the inroad for this project. We conducted not only desk research, where we put together a legal map of how the CRPD interacts with international humanitarian law. We then went to the field and went to several conflict-affected states, including Palestine, Ukraine, the DRC, Vietnam as a post-conflict setting, as well as Colombia, and looked at the implementation of both IHL and the CRPD in those conflict settings. That field research enabled us to then write reports on each of those conflict settings, which then fed into this overall report, which, as I said, is what we're here to present today. And the findings of that report, we hope, draw on the different natures of conflict, protracted conflicts, conflicts involving armed non-state actors, and we draw up 8 key findings and recommendations for states, for humanitarian organizations, as well as armed non-state actors. And so I'm just going to briefly go through a couple of those findings for you today before we open up the discussions. Although I've sort of now hopefully given you an understanding of what the project's about, I want to also make it clear what the project's not about, and the project is not about prevention. And the reason why I want to stress that point is because throughout the course of this project, prevention of disability, prevention of primary impairment is often mixed up with the rights of persons with existing disabilities. This comes up time and time again. When speaking with states, they would happily tell me, when I say, what are you doing about this, implementing the CRPD in armed conflict, or reading state reports to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? It is often said, we've ratified the Mind Ban Convention. But that's not an implementing measure under the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Convention is clear that it is about the rights of persons with existing disabilities and potentially prevention of secondary impairment. It is not about prevention of primary impairment. And the two, as I said, often muddled, which is very dangerous because resources, advocacy, time is put into prevention at the expense of ensuring persons with existing impairments have full access to their rights. So taking the Mine Ban Treaty as an example, it's obviously important in that some of the provisions that it contains do add to some disability rights perspective, particularly around reparation for survivors. But from a disability rights perspective, what you should be taking from the Mine Ban Treaty is mine education should be completely accessible, and mine warning systems around mine fields should be completely accessible. For example, for persons with visual impairments, having a mine sign outside a mined field in Colombia is of no help if you are a local person who has a visual impairment and can't read that sign. And as I said, this is something that came up time and time again, so I'm sorry to labour the points, but if we're going to take one thing away from tonight, I would really want to say prevention is not part of this conversation and this study. So returning to what the project is about, it's about, as I said, persons with disabilities, and so I think it's worth spending some time thinking about what we mean by persons with disabilities and who we're looking at and considering in this study. Before the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a very medicalised approach and a charity approach, that they were the two main models that were used to understand disability. Those two approaches focused on a person's impairment rather than the person themselves. And the person with a disability was seen as abnormal, in need of fixing, in some way leading a lesser and sadder life, and is obviously fueled by discriminatory understandings, prejudicial understandings of disabilities, and therefore the responses to disability were often under the same guise. What we have now that we have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is what's called a social model understanding of disability, where instead of the focus being on the impairment, the focus is on the interaction between the impairment and the environment. And so how the environment responds to a person's impairment is the disabling factor. And that's so important because from that perspective, we can understand that discriminatory barriers can be overcome for a start, and there is not the focus on the person with the impairment, but on society and the broader context to respond to the impairment and to the person, more importantly. And it also understands that disability is context dependent. So for our conversation tonight about conflict, it's easy to imagine a situation where a person with an impairment faces a greater level of disability, if you like, in a conflict setting than they would in a non-conflict setting. So if you're a wheelchair user, for example, and you're living in a state where there is fully accessible infrastructure, fully accessible public transport, education, etc., or public buildings, employment are accessible, you're not facing the same barriers as somebody who's a wheelchair user right now in Gaza. So it's really the social model understanding of disability that allows us to better respond to disability and to look at what we need to be doing to overcome the barriers that persons with disabilities face. So moving to some of the key findings of the research, the first big takeaway, which Marco has already alluded to, and what was most surprising for me is how overlooked this issue is. We know, as Marco has also said, that roughly 15% of every population is made up of persons with disabilities. That equates to about 1 billion people worldwide. Of course, a large number of those people will live in conflict-affected states. Persons with disabilities are the largest minority group. But when we come to discuss it, as has been said, that there's very little uptake of the issue. I've been working on this, as I said, for 3 years now. When I speak with states, it's considered a niche issue, and including within, has to be said, within humanitarian organizations as well. And that complete overlooking of the topic means that, of course, policy and practice is not being developed that responds to persons with disabilities, but it's also being fueled by the fact that where persons with disabilities are being considered, they're being considered just from really persons with physical impairments and not persons with psychosocial impairments, with sensory impairments, as well as intellectual impairments. So it's persons being forgotten, as I've said, but also then within those that are being forgotten, there is a distorted focus just on physical impairment and not other types of impairment. And it's also at the UN level as well. I mean, there's not to date been a single UN Security Council resolution that's been dedicated to this topic. Same within the Human Rights Council. And as, again, Marco has said, if you open the textbook of kind of any IHL textbook, in there often disability is excluded. It's not listed there. Many IHL training manuals don't include a disability perspective. So it's throughout all stakeholders, really, I would say, are really overlooking the topic. Another finding of the report is that disability is still being approached from this medical or charity understanding. It's not being approached from the social model understanding endorsed in the CRPD. And us as humanitarian lawyers and as practitioners need to be aware that when we interpret IHL norms that may not reflect the social model understanding as we see it today, that we need to be aware of the language that we're using, and we need to be aware that the IHL norms that we're considering need to be applied using that social model understanding and not the medical and charity model, which are largely reflected in the IHL texts. And then for, particularly being sat here in the ICRC, another big takeaway and the main finding really is the fact that IHL is not being applied in a disability inclusive manner, and that is resulting in the loss of life and serious injury. The briefing picks up several examples of this, from effective warnings to the treatment of prisoners of war. But I thought maybe for present purposes, we could just pick up proportionality and the proportionality assessment as a really basic example of how I've seen through my research that coming into play. So of course, with the proportionality assessment, the expected harm, the incidental harm, has to be balanced against the anticipated military advantage of any attack. When we look at law of armed conflict manuals, training manuals, when we look at considered states' interpretation of that norm, it's seen that states widely consider the civilian population to be one homogenous group of able-bodied persons who are all able to interpret and respond to the dangers around them in the same manner. And of course, that's a fallacy. As I said, 15% of every population will be made up of persons with disabilities. And they will have a diverse way, and a different way rather, of responding to the dangers around them. And so when we consider the incidental harm of any attack, we need to be considering just that. How will this affect the real civilian population in the vicinity? Which, as I said, will include persons with disabilities. So in the briefing, we give a hypothetical example, which I'm going to pose to you now just to maybe get the conversation started. So say that an attack is being proposed against an elusive high-level military commander who will be at a command post located next to a civilian building for a 30-minute period. It is not possible to send in ground troops, so it's decided that a precision-guided missile strike is to be undertaken. It is known that the next-door civilian building will be destroyed in the attack, which is a drop-in centre for unemployed job seekers, and normally has around 10 people in it at this time of day. It's proposed that a telephone warning, giving 1 minute warning to the drop-in centre, is given. Now, would the proportionality assessment change if we know that the civilians attending the drop-in centre that morning have physical, sensory or intellectual impairments, which would of course affect their ability to access and respond to the 1-minute warning, and then of course potentially the incidental harm of that attack? And I would strongly argue that it should and does affect the proportionality assessment, and indeed taking IHL's own principles of humanity and the prohibition on adverse distinction, which are of course the core of IHL, as well as the prohibition on discrimination against persons with disabilities within the CRPD, we have an obligation to ensure that it is considered. And I think that there's room for that as well, as Marco again alluded to, that IHL has the flexibility for us to take our modern understanding of disability and to take our growing knowledge and understanding of disability and read into IHL what might not have initially been considered by drafters. And I just wanted to, I'm probably running over time, so I think I'll probably leave it there, but as a concluding remark, I would say that we all have an obligation to mainstream disability in our understanding and our interpretation and our application of IHL. As I said, this is not being done at the moment, despite the fact that we know 15% of every population will be made up of persons with disabilities. And we have the CRPD, which again gives us the tools to look at IHL from a disability inclusive perspective. And we have IHL's own norms, like the principle of humanity and adverse distinction, which demand that we take this disability inclusive approach.
Thank you very much, Alice. That's extremely interesting. And certainly we'll look forward to hearing more examples. And I really encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the report, which goes, I think, into each of those findings with the really concrete examples to exemplify what you're talking about. So I'd like to go to Hugo next. One of ICRC's main areas of work is promoting IHL and the understanding of IHL. And Alice is telling us that, or her research, that there are significant gaps in the equal access of persons with disabilities to IHL protections. It's an area that we're just starting to work on here in ICRC. But I wanted to ask you that, from your perspective, how and with whom can ICRC advocate for protection of persons with disabilities so that their rights and IHL, CRPD are better understood?
Mina, thank you. And I want to just start by congratulating Alice, obviously, because it's a great report. And I think we're lucky to have it. And as Marco said, it's about time. So I think that's very important. It's been a good year for me in the Humanitarian because already, we're just at the beginning of May, I've had 2 panels where I'm genuinely delighted to see a report. And the first one was on dignity and displacement, and this one is on disability and armed conflict. And of course, they're deeply linked because it's about dignity. It's about seeing the person. And I think in answer to Mina's question, obviously as ICRC, we must make sure that all parties to conflict are actively thinking about this and that we're helping them to think about it in exactly the way that Alice has just described, thinking about the particular situation of disabled people, what it might mean for access, for early warning, for precautionary measures, for proportionality. All these things are important. And I think we must take that up now in our protection practice, in our legal dialogues, and I'm sure we will. And there are several ICRC lawyers here today who are actively engaged on this already, and this will help us, because this will bring it to policy level as well, at a wider level, and that will help. I think also, if I might just say, we've talked about proportionality and precautionary measures and early warnings and taking account of the situation of disabled people. I think there are all sorts of other ways in ICRC practice we can improve as well. It's very clear in IHL, and it would be absolutely in line with the CRDP on this, that when we are engaged in the provision of relief and when other organizations are engaged in the provision of relief, we must think about disabled people and we must adapt and modify the way we give relief, the places, the times, the types of relief we give to include disabled people. So I think there's lots of other areas where we need to engage with relief providers, with parties to conflict, and of course for the ICRC with detention authorities, because that's another key area where obviously disabled people fall totally under the principle of humane treatment in detention. But, there has to be reasonable accommodation as well that we need to think about for people who are disabled and detained, and particular measures that should be taken by detaining authorities. So it's a very big and practical agenda for us, but you've clarified it, and you've put it in the public mind, and that's a great contribution.
Yeah, I completely agree, absolutely. And there's a lot that we as ICRC can do as well. Alice, I was wondering if you, I think Hugo touched upon a few areas where are really, where ICRC works and how we can be inclusive. Could you give us, considering that the people that we're working with, as you mentioned in your report, they don't have a good understanding about disability. In fact, I would go further. It's not just about people with disabilities being forgotten, it's also about the misunderstanding of disability, like you said. So what would be some sort of examples of specific points or messages that you would want us to take forward, and also others?
Well, going back to this question, if you don't mind, that you posed to Hugo, one thing I would add is that the ICRC is in a unique position in itself, being able to gather disability inclusive data, and that is dramatically missing at the moment. The data that we do have is often under-inclusive and based on, again, the medical or charity models, and focuses just on persons with physical impairment and not sensory, intellectual and psychosocial impairment. So I think that, as I said, the ICRC is in a unique position to be able to do that itself, and also particularly in terms of its access to places of detention. Very little, if nothing, exists in terms of the treatment of prisoners of war and internees with disabilities. So that's where there is a serious kind of void in our understanding, and where the ICRC could play a role, and that will involve delegates being trained on disability rights and the diversity of disability as well, to ensure that when they go about collecting such data, when they go about their visits to places of detention, they know what to look for, they know how and to engage with persons with disabilities, to ensure that in the detention centre, in the place of detention, people with disabilities have access to all facilities and services within the place of detention, and not, again, just this focus on medical services and rehabilitation.
So one thing Alice just mentioned too was the diversity of disability. So understanding that the different kinds of impairments and the barriers that, like the different kinds of barriers that interact. One thing that we in ICRC are discussing is also, the intersectionality. So recognizing that also persons with disabilities are not just one homogeneous group, but their interactions with or intersections with gender or with age or other dimensions of diversity. And Hugo, you've had some really interesting blog on this. I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on this.
I can try if I can remember the blog. But,
we can Google it.
No, that's right. We can Google it quickly. No, I think that's absolutely right, because we mustn't fall into the trap of seeing disabled people as one type of person. And as we've all said, it's all too easy just to think of physical disability and to forget a much wider spectrum. I mean, the point you give about mine warnings and things, that you need to be, if you can't see a mine warning, you need another way of knowing that there are mines there, and that's classically intersectional, because you might be a child, you might be a man, a woman, you might be all sorts of different types of social identity involved, but that one would slice through a lot of that and determine whether or not you live or die in relation to a minefield. So I think we have to think about diversity with disability, as we do with everything else today, to understand the particular needs of people, or as Marco said, the particular rights of people in these situations. And I find it nice that with this subject, we can talk very clearly about rights and not just needs, because of the sort of co-applicability of the convention with IHL, and the clear statement in Article 11 of the convention that this convention applies in IHL. So in war. So we must recognize diversity, I think. And it's difficult. You know, we have to train ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to go to Ezekiel next. So through your work at Geneva Call, you really have a great deal of experience engaging with armed non-state actors and navigating those political sensitivities between state and non-state groups. So obviously these negative stereotypes and stigmatization of persons with disabilities are prevalent among the armed non-state actors as well. What avenues do you see there could be to engage with the armed non-state actors to ensure that they're also implementing the IHL and respecting the rights of persons with disabilities?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation and for having Geneva Call today, and congratulations for the report as well, which I found it great. So for those who don't know, Geneva Call is a humanitarian non-governmental organization that engages armed non-state actors on humanitarian norms, both on IHL and human rights law. So we go to the field and we talk to them about international law, and we literally have open discussions about the challenges that they might face when they try to comply with these norms. So I think I'm going to pick what you said in the end about, I think there is a key aspect of the people, us humanitarians engaging with the parties to the conflict. We have to be prepared to talk about this. And we might think that this is kind of obvious, but it's not always the case. Even when you come to an armed non-state actor, but I think when you come to a state forces as well, and you present some protection cases and you prioritize the cases, I think it is key that as humanitarians we embrace also the problems that persons with disabilities they have in the field. So just as a first step, and I'm saying this because engaging with our non-state actors, and this is part of what I was going to say in the answer. So there are different challenges in terms of compliance, and I always say, and this is why it is very important to engage with them, because in general, first of all, there is a lack of knowledge of international law. So they might know certain rules, but they might not know other rules. And I always say this, but in any given society, the number of people who knows about the law is very small. The number of people who knows about international law is even smaller. Who knows about IHL, even smaller. Human rights law, IHL, criminal law is tiny. So I'm an IHL lawyer, and I think we always have this kind of expectation of saying, okay, there is an armed conflict, and this group they follow all these elements that the jurisprudence of the ICTY they had provided. So it's like, of course, they know about their international obligations, and this is not always the case. So I think in order to increase their knowledge of international law, of their obligations in the battlefield, one way is direct engagement, and this is what Geneva Call does. And I think if we want to actually increase the protection of persons with disabilities in the field, in that direct engagement, we have to be prepared to raise the issues of persons with disabilities. Because otherwise, we're going to always keep at the surface of the topic and of the different protection levels. So we're going to raise issues about conduct of hostilities, but perhaps because I've seen this with different people working in the field, for fear of perhaps losing the contact with that person or the reaction of the interlocutor, we don't raise protection issues. And I think this is key. It is key to be prepared to raise protection issues with those stakeholders in order to increase the protection of individuals in the field. And of course, lack of knowledge is one of the problems, but there is also another issue in terms of lack of capacity. When we speak about states and they can become parties to international treaties, including the Convention for the Protection of Persons with Disabilities, when we speak about armed groups, is how do we deal with their lack of capacity to address with persons with disabilities living in the territories that they control, or in terms of conduct of hostilities or with other IHL-related issues. And lack of capacity is a problem, is a challenge that we see and when we talk to them.
I think the lack of capacity is an issue that also humanitarian organizations face. It's in very clear analysis report what the gaps are in terms of humanitarian organizations, not adapting our programs so that people with disabilities can access them. So it's a really valid point. But what actually kind of an open question to everybody, that what can we do to build our own capacity also to be able to talk about these with whoever our interlocutors are?
Shall I have a go? I mean, I think it's partly what I was saying earlier, that we all have to, I mean, maybe it's not all of us, because maybe many of you are already very sensitized to this, and you're able to see disability more easily than a lot of other people. But that must be the first step. And I think we have to just keep banging on about inclusion, about disability, about different types of disability. And we have to really insert into our policies and into our natural instincts of working, thinking about accessibility, thinking about modification. These things, reasonable accommodation, it's a slightly clunky, legally thing, but it's about bringing that into the mindset of people who are doing needs assessments, people who are then doing program design, people who are going into a prison and thinking. And our own offices, it's pretty shocking. I mean, ICRC is no model on this. A lot of our offices are very badly accessible for disabled people of all kinds. And, probably if we start there, then we really understand and think about what it means for people to be able to get where they need to be or get away from the danger. It's a mindset.
Oh, if I may add, just I think, yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think it has to be also a protection priority. So when you are a humanitarian actor and you're engaging the parties to the conflict, and you are selecting the issues that you want to raise with that party to the conflict, the possible allegations, this has to be a priority. And we need to have the reflex also when actually addressing the problems, to identify these type of challenges, and a lot of internal capacity building of all humanitarian actors. I guess that's needed to have that reflex.
If I may, just to add that I completely agree with everything that's been said about access and how we provide reasonable accommodation. The best people to speak with about that are persons with lived experience of disability, and as we've said, the diverse range of disabilities. And there are very strong organisations out there of persons with disabilities, and the mantra of the disability rights community is indeed nothing about us without us. And so at all stages of policy, planning, implementation, and monitoring, persons with disabilities themselves must be meaningfully and actively engaged.
Anything to add?
I can add when I speak.
Sure.
I'll actually start with responding to maybe.
Oh, fantastic. I have one more question for Ezekiel, and then certainly we'll go to this. So Geneva Call also has interesting work with the deeds of commitment.
Yep.
Through which armed non-state actors can commit to and apply international standards. For example, you have deeds of commitment on child protection and the prohibition and prevention of sexual violence. So drawing from maybe some comparisons with the work that's been done against sexual violence, what would a deed of commitment on protection of persons with disabilities look like, in your opinion?
So the deed of commitment is a kind of a unilateral declaration that armed groups can sign. They commit to respect international rules, international norms. They come to Geneva, to the Old Town, where the first Geneva Convention was adopted in 1864, and they signed this deed of commitment. And then, so this is just a very brief comment on the deeds. And then they commit to respect certain international norms, and then Geneva Call has the possibility to go and monitor whether Geneva Call, through partner organizations, if the deed is respected or not. So it's kind of a full package. It's not just a political statement and then that's it. So a new deed and this has been included as part of the research of the briefing. I think the deed, there are different problems with the deed. So it's like I like it very much, but it entails a big amount of resources, because when it's not, the deed should not be seen in isolation. The deed implies training. It's not just one shot. So the deed implies training the group, implies having a dialogue with the group, implies having being able to monitor whether the deed is respected or not afterwards. So this is why last year we launched our 4th deed on healthcare, but this is only where we have only a few, because the amount of resources that we spend when we have a group that signs the deed is not just the signature, is all around the signature, is the engagement process that took before the signing ceremony and what's coming after the signing ceremony. So a deed specifically protecting persons with disability, I think it would be an interesting project, an interesting endeavor in the future. Last year we launched our last one on the protection of healthcare, the protection of the wounded and sick, the protection. So there might be some avenues in which the protection of persons with disabilities can go through this new deed that was launched in November of 2018. But yeah, I think it's a big process. The creation, the drafting of a deed, the engagement of the actors on a specific thematic issue, the development of new training material. So it's it's one part of the engagement process.
Yeah, absolutely, and the monitoring of it too.
Yes, so we will have to. It's a matter of resources. We have to go there and see whether all the obligations of the deed are being respected or not, and then raise the possible violations to the commanders of the group, and so it's quite, resourceful.
Right. So Alice, this was actually one of the points that you raised in your report, and the recommendation that there should be a deed of commitment on this. What are your thoughts on what it would look like?
I mean, it has to be said that I, sat and had the comfort of writing this report on my desk, and I'm an academic, so I'm blissfully unaware of all of these kind of practical implementation issues and resources. But yes, I do say that the ultimate goal should be, in the context of armed non-state actors, is to have a deed of commitment, and it is something that I argue for in the briefing, but I do appreciate that maybe in the short-term future, that's wishful thinking, but that's okay. I mean, this is the very start of this conversation, from my understanding. This is the first major study that looks at disability and armed conflict. So the first of many, I hope, and I hope that maybe in 3-4 years' time, we're having the same conversation, but we're talking about, this new draft deed of commitment, what are we going to do? How do we make sure it's...
No, if I may add something, and I'm going to finish with this because I've spoken too much about the deed of commitment, but we have worked with other tools of engagement. So it's not because there might not be tomorrow a deed of commitment on the protection of persons with disabilities, there cannot be an impact through, for instance, code of conduct or internal laws of the groups. So this is something that we could have an impact. So again, I think it's part of our capacity building to be able to sit down with the groups and say, listen, you can include issues related to the protection of persons with disabilities in your code of conduct.
Yeah.
Regarding, for instance, the protection of detainees or how they take precautionary measures. So this is something that it's more foreseeable, I would say, in the near future.
Okay, great. That's very interesting. We look forward to seeing some of that work. So I'd like to turn to Shahzad next. The UNHCR has led extensive consultations with member states on the Global Compact on Refugees. And actually this December, UNHCR is convening the first ever Global Refugee Forum. As it's come up here, and then Alice in her report mentions many times and shows how states and humanitarian organizations, how there are gaps in the implementation of the rights of persons with disabilities in context of armed conflict. So could you tell us, how does the Global Compact on Refugees guide states and other actors in their response to persons with disabilities or forcibly displaced by armed conflict?
Thank you very much for having me, UNHCR, and for also actually posing a question linked to the Global Compact on Refugees, because we put a great deal of hope in that, in particular as regards its implementation. But maybe before I really get into that, if I could just comment about a few things that I heard and I very much appreciated. Firstly, I have to start by sincerely congratulating you, Alice, for this work and for everyone behind it that was listed at the outset, that I won't repeat. It's an incredible piece of work. It really is. And I can't claim, I have to admit, that I've read everything in detail. But I really, if you do not have the time to read everything, just read at least the recommendations at the end. the page 74 to 78 or whatever the numbers are, you'll be able to tell us. What I found to be the most striking and what I appreciated the most, I really have to say, is that we're in the midst of this whole excitement around the SDGs and leave no one behind. And when you see that juxtaposed against the theme or the title of what we're here to discuss, really around the first to be forgotten. And the two, I find it, it's very sad. I think it's realistically very sad. But when you read the recommendations, and tied to your question about how do you build capacities, I think the first thing to do to build capacities is inform yourself, including as humanitarian partners, humanitarian workers, lawyers. You're an international humanitarian lawyer, I'm a human rights, refugee law. Honestly, I read it, and I found it quite surprising in that there's nothing that you say, wow, I didn't think of that. But it's incredible how much you actually didn't think of that. And that was an incredible realization for me. And that's the type of reflex that we need to start having. As we heard Hugo say, the need to really have that reflex in order for us to be able to effectively build the capacities of others, we need to first build our own capacities in this field. And as we also heard at the outset, many books, many documents written, many training, and the word disability never shows up in it. And so my strong plea right at the outset is really the first thing we need to do if we want to have an impact is we need to educate ourselves in this field. And really, I think you have really left your mark with this. So thank you very much for that. Tied to that is there's no doubt that there's a disproportional impact of armed conflict context for persons who have disabilities. And you have obvious ones, like higher mortality rates, being left behind in the context of any kind of evacuation that might be taking place, a heightened risk of exploitation, abuse, of violence. These are all the realities of persons in situations of armed conflict, but heightened for persons who have disabilities. And equally, I think as humanitarian workers, we are needing to increasingly appreciate and recognize that there are serious barriers that persons with disabilities face when they're seeking to access humanitarian support and humanitarian services, physical obstacles, inaccessible communication. These are all the issues that were already said, but I think that as humanitarian agencies and workers, it's the first thing we need to be aware of these barriers and to identify them and to seek to address them and realize how heightened they are in the context of armed conflict. What we've, in UNHCR, I'd have to say, very much appreciated in this research, because it's also very much in line with not only our work, but also the vision that we really tried to set out when we were drafting the Global Compact on Refugees, was its rights-based approach. Now, the Global Compact on Refugees in no way sought to set out new rights. It wasn't about new legal obligations in any way. It's a document that's been drafted with a way to seek how we can actually bring support to states, to host communities, and to the refugees in a manner that strengthens that refugee protection space that exists. And so it draws on a range of existing legal frameworks, obviously starting with the 1951 Convention, but equally on the CRPD. And I think that's the important aspect to stress, and not to forget the incredible importance of the CRPD when it comes to armed conflict. So you talk about the deeds of commitment. I think we shouldn't ignore that also the CRPD foresees that its committee itself also requests questions and response from states on how they are dealing with these issues and the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of armed conflict. So we have to be able to use these tools to its full extent as we go forward. Equally, what I think is very valuable in the report, and what we sought to also seek to properly address in the context of the Global Compact on Refugees, was that we really sought, and as the report says, not to view persons with disabilities as passive victims. you've articulated nothing about us without us. It's really the mantra that we feel is key in order to have the right impact. No one knows better the barriers and how to overcome them than the persons who might be living them. And so this is an important element, and to really recognize persons with disabilities as rights holders, with agency, with capacity, and their importance of engaging effectively. So this was very much the vision we tried to put in place as we were drafting the Global Compact on Refugees, and actually bringing organizations of persons with disabilities to the table for that discussion, and to actually have us gain from their knowledge as we were seeking to draft the Global Compact on Refugees. So that partnership for us, both in the drafting, but I have to say importantly moving forward in its implementation, has and will continue to be key. Now, maybe just a few words more directly to respond to your question on the Global Compact on Refugees. Like I said, it is not about new rights. It's about creating or addressing what we feel has been a significant gap in the international community and the international refugee legal framework, which is responsibility and burden sharing. It's recognizing that 80 or 85% of the world's displaced and refugees are actually hosted in developing countries that seriously have their own development challenges. And so we wanted to find ways to basically establish a type of a responsibility sharing scheme that brought additional support to these large hosting communities so they could support their own nationals, but refugees at the same time. And so it foresees that type of a responsibility sharing scheme, but at the same time, it outlines a type of a program of action of what are the areas of support that are needed. And it's in that context that we sought to weave in issues around rights of persons with disabilities in a manner that ensures that they're not ignored in the context of the type of supports that would be foreseen to be provided to member states as they're supporting the hosting of refugees. So I have to say, it might not sound fantastic, but I think it's a positive step in that if we look at the Global Compact on Refugees, so I should also encourage you to read that as well, not just Alice's study, but there are no less than 20 references to disability issues in the Global Compact on Refugees. So this includes references to strengthening national capacities for reception of refugees that are sensitive to the needs of persons with disabilities, improving access to education, protection of children with disabilities, access to safe and nutritious food, and self-reliance for persons with disabilities. And importantly, right at the outset of the Global Compact on Refugees, it actually takes very much a rights-based approach through an inclusive vision, which calls on engagement of persons with disabilities, both in the host communities and in the refugee communities, in order to help develop the types of support that might be needed and the types of programs that might be needed in a rights-based manner. And importantly also, the Global Compact on Refugees, right at its outset, makes a call to states to bring persons with disabilities to the table in all fora where these issues of responses are being addressed. And that's very much clearly articulated right at the outset. So if I can just give some more couple of examples. So you have the Global Compact that talks about persons with disabilities being at a heightened risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse. And it recognizes that these risks are further heightened in armed conflict and forced displacement circumstances. And it emphasizes the need for the systems in the states to respond to these heightened risks, and requires that all prevention and response programs are accessible to people with different types of disabilities. So these are hooks that are included in the Global Compact that enable us to have that reflex, to not forget to think about these issues when we're, I'll speak very fast. Just another very quick example, accessing jobs and livelihoods. that is very much core to the Global Compact on Refugees, about bringing partners to the table to bring greater investment to these developing countries who are hosting refugees for job creations. And so the Global Compact actually talks about states and stakeholders promoting economic opportunities, decent job creation and entrepreneurship programs for refugees, including refugees with disabilities. Silly, it might sound, but it was like a period where, probably all of us in this table are old enough to remember how we used to edit documents and we would put in comma, including women. Well, it's got us where we are today. So, these references are actually very important references. And we had great support from states to see them included in the Global Compact on Refugees. And so I think one other key aspect, I'm sorry, I just have to mention it, is the need for data, that it's disaggregated data that really addresses these types of issues, that importantly also recognizes that persons with disabilities are not homogeneous, as we just heard, and that needs to very much be considered. You have to know your population in order to have the effective response and the right impact that you want to have. So lots of references in the Global Compact on Refugees, lots of possibilities. Of course, key is implementation. Mm-hmm. And key is ensuring that we get the support, that states get the support that they need to ensure that they can actually follow through with all of these commitments. But really the hooks are there. And I think that hopefully with this growing reflex, we'll start having proper responses that consider very much the rights approach for the persons with disabilities.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning data. That was going to be my follow-up question, but so I'm glad to hear it's in there. And also, it's really interesting to hear how this process has been done in a way that engages with those organizations of persons with disabilities, so in a participatory way, which is one of the things that Alice also mentioned is important. Before we go to the Q&A, I want to ask Alice one final question about one of your recommendations, because it touches upon what Shahrazad mentioned about the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities being one of the tools. And I think, when it comes to the state obligations that Shahrazad was talking about, that is also one of the mechanisms that can follow up with the state. So in your key findings and recommendations, you mentioned that the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a unique role in the contextual interpretation of both IHL and CRPD. And your recommendation is that the committee enhances its own capacity on IHL. So how would you envision this happening? I mean, what does that mean for the committee?
I mean, maybe I've not making myself very popular with that recommendation in the committee itself, because I go a bit further and I say that I don't say it can be a mechanism, I say it should be, and indeed the committee has the mandate already and an obligation already to be considering in state reports, what is this state doing to implement the rights of persons with disabilities in armed conflict alongside IHL norms that would be applicable. And of the state reports I've read to date, they are not fulfilling their mandate in that regard. And speaking with the committee, it appears that that's because there is a lack of capacity at the moment. So we actively need to be engaging with the committee to help increase their capacity. The committee itself, when it appoints new committee members, needs to not just be seeking out committee members with expertise on disability, but also expertise on IHL. And of course, there's no excuse if they're coming into Geneva. They've got the ICRC up the road. They've got us at the Geneva Academy. We can all help enhance that capacity, and we're ready to actively engage with them on that. But as I said, it's for me, it's not a voluntary, or it's an obligation that they already have. And at the moment, that mechanism is not meeting its potential. Yeah. It's not very diplomatic, I'm sorry. It's in the report, so I can't hide behind it now.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to open up for Q&A with the audience, and I already see one hand up there. So it's We have a couple of microphones coming around. So here, Tina is first. And please introduce yourself, and then if your question is
close,
for a specific speaker, then please let us know who you would like to respond.
I will. My name is Tina Tinde. I work as an advisor on prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse at the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. I'm lucky to be a colleague of Mina. Congratulations to all. Congratulations to the author. This is very, very important stuff. I'm glad to be here again. We had a celebration in this room in December 2016 of the 10th anniversary of the convention. And we had fabulous speakers. We had 2 speakers coming in from the US who are experts on technical assistive technology, who are blind. We had a fabulous moderator who's a lawyer from the High Commission for Human Rights who was in a wheelchair. And we had a call-in by Skype from Red Cross volunteer with a mental disability from Trinidad and Tobago. And we had 2,000 people following it live. So this is a very good room for us to be in. I have a question to anyone in the panel who has any idea. I'm particularly interested in representation in any organization that we work in. Having people on board who work there, who actually have experience living with a disability would be very important. But this often falls by the wayside in recruitment strategies, etc. So I wonder, how would you recommend to convince the leadership of all of our organizations to set a target, a quota of, for instance, 15% of people with disabilities? And this would be particularly relevant for humanitarian agencies because of all the challenges that we have heard about in terms of emergencies. So if we could try to work on recruiting people with disabilities to our organizations, let's try and do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. So I see one in the back, and then Alex will be next.
Thank you. My name is Joseph. I am from a master's student here at Sarah. And, well, nice to meet you, Tina. So my question generally is about, previously, before I came here, I used to work with the National Society. And I was managing a project on mainstreaming disability in emergency relief and recovery operations. And I must say it was very frustrating at some point because in the project I was working in, this was about the second phase, because there was a previous phase about 3 years, this was the second phase. And before actually I came here, there was a third phase now of another project. And what is interesting is the fact that how organizations basically have a learning disability. So it becomes very difficult to address issues about disability when we ourselves, cannot be able to learn or rather manage the knowledge we have acquired in the past experiences. So I don't know what is the kind of approach we could generally use to address this issue as far as learning, and organizational learning culture or institutional memory is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's a question here in the front.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Alexander Beitig. I'm a legal advisor at the ICRC, and among other thematic files, I also have the disability file within the legal division. So I was, of course, especially pleased also to see such an in-depth analysis of the complementary relationship between IHL and the CRPD, as well as the overall message that I got, and that I think is worth taking further to bring the various practitioners, communities, on the one hand the traditional humanitarians, but also the disability community together in terms of then strengthening the implementation operationally of this issue. And my question now picks up on the one aspect that was touched upon last during the panel, when you talked about reviewing the implementation. So you were first emphasizing the unique and potentially in practice even further-reaching role of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but you also mentioned some of the other stakeholders, including one forum, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement in this year, further down the line will be pretty actively engaged in, notably the International Conference on the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, just to look at something in the near future. And you also said that this could also be a forum to review the implementation of IHL and the CRPD. So was wondering if you could say something further on that and elaborate a bit more on that. What would be your vision of this forum for advancing these issues? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for a really excellent question. So we had a question on recruitment of persons with disabilities into our organizations. How do we convince our leadership of the importance of this and how to go about it? Open it up to you.
I mean, it's just so sad that we have to talk about convincing the leadership for a start. I mean, there's a huge talent pool that's not being tapped into if you don't ensure that you can recruit persons with disabilities. I mean, you can benefit from their expertise. So, and I would, again, go back to the CRPD that makes it clear that through the provision of reasonable accommodation, which basically means that including for private entities like employers, they must take measures to accommodate the needs of persons with disabilities so that they can access that place of employment. It's not a complete obligation in that it mustn't pose an undue burden on the place of employment. But for example, for somebody who relies on an assistive dog, ensuring that that employee allows the dog into the place of employment, that would be a reasonable accommodation for the employer to make. And as I said, I think that it's an obligation under the CRPD, and that by the argument should be put to those that maybe are slightly hesitant that you're missing out on this massive talent pool. So that would be, yeah.
Shahrazad, you had also. Sorry, no.
Thank you. Yeah. I would obviously definitely agree that we are missing out on an incredible talent pool. That also will bring to the table aspects that persons who do not have disabilities would not actually know about, because they're, we have issues. Before joining UNHCR, I worked with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. There are lots of issues around geographic composition. The case is always being made, different perspectives that need to come into the discussions. In a lot of ways, if we want to have the right impact, we need to understand. And so a greater non-homogeneous group in our staff is equally as relevant. To my mind, and based on what I personally actually experienced when I tried to raise one of these issues for a colleague who had disabilities, was not that it's not that often with our management, it's not that there's no will, but there's just, again, with all due respect to management, I am one as well, often we don't think about it. We don't think about the impact, and we need someone to raise it. So, for example, the UN has policies where it forces some of our colleagues to take contract breaks. It's a simple example, but contract breaks, colleagues who don't have stable contracts are required to take a 3-month contract break for obligations that would or would not attach then to the UN subsequently. And the impact of someone who has to then take a forced 3-month contract break is greater for a person with disabilities than it is for someone who doesn't have disabilities, if you just look on the accommodation aspect, where they've had, according to the colleague who I had working in my team, they had gone through great expense and effort to find a place in Geneva where they could live because of the elevator scheme and doing the bathroom, the person is in a wheelchair. And basically, we made a case to the management that by forcing all colleagues across the board to take these 3-month contract breaks without noting the difference impact, one could make a discrimination case. And we appreciated and understood, and it's beyond our salary scales to understand issues that the Fifth Committee might have decided on why there needs to be contract breaks. But what exactly is the legal difference between a 3-week to a 1-month contract break, versus, which maybe the person could handle, versus a 3-month contract break? So we actually changed the rules in that context. And we're able to say, you know, a 1-month contract break would meet the needs and the requirements of the UN, legal, while at the same time was respective of the impact and the difference impact. So these are the types of things that I think we need to reflect upon. And I really sincerely believe that the management is very open to it, but we just yet don't have this reflex. So I go back to Hugo's point about the need for greater reflex in this context.
Yeah, thank you. Hugo.
Well, I think, thinking of the first two questions, I think you get the answer to the second question from the first question. Because I think if you want to create more, better learning organizations that understand disability better and what to do about it, the simple way to do that is to, as Alice has said and as your question says, is to include more of them in your organization and get greater representation. So I would hope, I'm not sure what we're doing at ICRC, but I would hope that we are aiming very clearly for a 15% target, because that would seem normal to me. And I think that will help us then become much more, just instinctively understanding of disability. And so let's hope we are. You'll have to tell me later if we are.
It is on the table. It has been for a few years, so we're trying to work on this. Great to know we have your support. But yeah, that brings us to the second question. So, based on the experience from the field, like how do we learn from our experiences? How can we get better at being more inclusive and adapting our programming? And this was one point. So in terms of our staff diversity, which also Sarjad touched upon. Having diverse workforce brings diverse thinking into decision making and so on. But any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, if I might jump.
Please.
So I think there are 2 points that I think deserve further attention with respect to the first 2 questions. One is I think everyone needs to be more vocal about this. So we have to speak about this. There should be public campaigns specifically aiming to raise awareness about this within the humanitarian realm, which is, until now, I don't think that was the case. And the other one, because this is kind of the Geneva Call approach, that we are bottom-up and not top-down, but I think the role of the donors and states here is kind of important as well, is key as well. Because they are the ones behind giving funds to the organizations. And I think there is a role to play there as well, pushing for this agenda within the humanitarian organization or within the international organizations. And I think it's very interesting that this is a human rights treaty that allows international regional organizations to become parties to the treaty. So I think that there is something behind that should be further explored. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that point. We have many representatives from permanent missions here. Be glad to hear this. The third question was about the international conference. So this is, I think, Alice, your recommendation that we should put these issues on the table. So how would you see? What are some of the issues, if I understood correctly? What are some of the issues that we can take forth in the international conference?
As has been said, I argue that it should be on the agenda. Is it this year? I don't think it is at the moment. It should be. I would argue that it should be a permanent item on the agenda. I would argue that to ensure that you have, as I said, a reflection of lived experience of persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities with lived experience from conflict should be included as participants and as active stakeholders in the conference itself. And disability isn't just put as a sort of a side issue on a specific topic, as a side panel. It should be mainstreamed throughout the entire conference, and every thematic issue that's looked at should include a disability inclusive perspective.
I couldn't agree
Silence.
more. I couldn't agree more. So yeah, I'm happy to let you know what we are doing for the international conference. But it's true, it's not on the agenda. But this is something where our colleagues from the permanent missions can really help bring that message forward, as well as us Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations. So we are running out of time. So to close, I would ask. Sorry, okay, one more question from Mary,
If
please.
I may, sorry, I already have a mic, sorry. If I may, can I go ahead?
Okay, two
I had
questions.
a quick question, sorry. My name is Rasha, I'm Amnesty International's Yemen researcher. I'm currently working on a project where I'm going on mission to Yemen and I'm looking at the rights of people who have been impaired by the current conflict and whose impairments have been worsened by the current conflict. I think I'm struggling with one thing a little bit from a practical perspective. The CRPD is great and Yemen has ratified it in its optional protocol. It is my understanding that it is an obligation of means. How would you deal with the fact that the Yemeni population has a high proportion of disabled and impaired people due to different reasons? How would you deal with a state that doesn't have the means to provide for them? I suppose I came here for that answer today because I'm struggling, so I thought I'd just leave that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have a second question, and it's the last question from Mary over here.
Thank you all very much. I have two short comments and then a question. One is that the slogan that persons with disabilities use, I found it very helpful. So, not about us, without us. We said it already, but it's incredibly simple to remember, and it's really helpful in terms of, I just say that to all of you, it's really easy to take that one home with you, and I think that would get us a long way on some of the mindset issues that we were talking about. My second point is just to add to the list of things that should be, could be, need to be done. We didn't say investment directly. And so we talked about investment in human resources, but we talked about donor and involvement. But I think also we'll have to get to the point where we actually have some figures and some measurement around this. So data disaggregation, but here I'm talking about investing in this, because if we don't invest, we all spend a lot of time talking about a lot of things and it doesn't move forward. So I would just say, yes, it's about donors, but it's also about our own organizations actually taking a decision to invest money and resources into this. And my question is about practice, good practice. I was wondering, Alice, if you might give us a few more examples. And I'm really asking about shaping humanitarian policy. Have you seen on the ground interesting practice, the how to do it, that you might share with us?
Thank you. Thank you for the really good questions again. Sorry, we're not going to be able to take more questions, but our speakers are staying for the refreshments at the end. So if you do have further questions, I encourage you to approach them. So let's start with the question from the back. So, the state's obligations to implement the CRPD. I mean, there are many countries globally that that are low-income countries and may not have the means to do so. Mm-hmm. How do you respond?
So, I mean, the CRPD, another unique aspect of it, as you may be aware, is that it includes civil and political rights, as well as economic and social cultural rights. Now, that obviously it's the latter where there is progressive realisation. But for civil and political rights, they need to be implemented now, the moment that the state ratifies it. And included in that is the norm of non-discrimination. So progressive realisation doesn't apply to services that are already available if they are not being applied in a disability inclusive manner. That is discrimination, and that is in violation of the CRPD. Of course, there are, as I said, economic and social cultural rights which relate to culture and education, which does allow for the state's economic situation to be taken into account. But I would stress that when you go to Yemen, and if you're looking at the provisions of services, look at how the services are being provided. Are they accessible? And if they're not being provided in an accessible manner, that may amount to discrimination, as I said, which would be in violation of the CRPD.
Yes, please.
I'm going to add just, I think I agree, but just, I think it's very interesting the way Article 11 is drafted, because it says that that state parties shall actually take all necessary measures. And when you go to the drafting of this article, and they say that they actually, it's based on an article of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is drafted exactly in the same way, but instead of saying necessary measures, it says feasible measures. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what happened in between, but the changing of this word, feasible for necessary measures, I think it's kind of, in this specific issue, it's important.
Yeah, thank you. Really good points.
I was of two minds of whether I should respond or not, to be honest. But I thought I would throw in a reflection, seriously in the spirit of partnership between NGOs such as Amnesty and the UN, such as UNHCR. State response is one thing. If I were in your shoes, I would be also interested to see how humanitarian services are being provided in a place like Yemen. And look to see how, again, in the spirit of increasing capacities and knowledge on this area, acknowledging that it's relatively new, our appreciation of the need and the importance of doing this, to maybe help guide some of the colleagues in Yemen in terms of carrying out that type of humanitarian services and assistance in a manner that is respective of the rights and conscious of the impact, including evacuations out of Yemen for migrants and refugees there.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think the problem of means is not an unusual problem. It's a common problem in everything we do, and I think the answer has to be partnership and responsibility. And I would tend to agree with the last point that Shahrazad has made, that, probably a culture at this stage of encouragement and connection rather than shaming and critique might help. Amnesty, possibly.
Thank you. So then to our last question from Mary, which I think was asking about some perhaps examples you might have from the field.
Good practice. Yeah, there really wasn't much to go by, I'm afraid. In Gaza and in Ukraine, actually, I met with the cluster groups there, the humanitarian cluster groups, obviously work in coordination with each other about the implementation of humanitarian responses, and they were beginning to go about gathering data, which is obviously the essential starting point, and disaggregated data. As again, we've talked about ensuring that the data you have, it doesn't just focus on one type of impairment, it also includes other characteristics like gender and age. So that was one good practice that was starting to be done. And it was starting to be an agenda item. It wasn't a permanent agenda item, but it certainly, it was the start of the conversation. But unfortunately, I can't offer you any other concrete good practice examples that I came across in our states. Happy to hear from you if you know others or better.
So what about examples to learn from? So one of the things I constantly get also asked for, like quote, best practices. And I personally don't believe there's a best practice. I feel like there's good practices. But I think sometimes it's useful for us to think about what's happening and what we can learn from them and how are others learning from them. So do you have anything to share from that perspective?
So many bad practices of how not to do it.
Well,
that's not helpful.
No, they are very helpful. They are helpful.
Which is the report is full of. So, I mean, there was lots of poor practice around the inclusion on the collection of disability data. So I met with numerous states. He said, if we've only got 3% of our population has some form of disability, which is obviously dramatically under the official stat from the WHO. And that's because they have under-inclusive data. That under-inclusive data then feeds under-inclusive policy. Resources are not allocated in the correct manner, and that feeds the cycle, again, of ignorance of disability. So yeah, going back to the point, and maybe the take-home message for me for all of this is we need to now immediately start gathering good data, all actors do, from states to humanitarian organisations that have actors, and ensuring that that data is fully inclusive and representative of the real situation, the real lived experience of persons with disabilities, and then developing policy on the basis of that data. And I'm not saying that's an easy task, but that needs to be done now. And until we have that data, using the 15%, which is a strong estimate from the WHO, as our basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Mark, we're going to have to close. And so I would like to thank our panelists really very much for your insights and a really interesting discussion. And to close, I would like to hear from you, what is one important takeaway message that you got yourself from this evening? And start with Shahzad.
I'm a note taker. So it was a bit awkward for me too. So I try to, as you were speaking, there were so many issues that came to my mind, and I thought this is so interesting. I actually don't know from my notes what I want to identify as the most important thing. There are a number. I'm not going to identify which one is the most important, the number one thing. There are a lot of things I want to take away. But personally, I'd like to say that I think I've very much realized and appreciated the importance of not looking this as a niche. I don't know who said it, but someone said it. Importance of not seeing this as a niche and really not also falling into the trap. I think you also said that and when you do look at it, that we have to stop looking at it from a distorted focus on physical impairment, to really look at it look at the issues much more comprehensively. And I think once we get out of that mentality of it's a very particular niche area and start really looking at mainstreaming this issue, I think we'll make important advances.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ezekiel.
Yes, I'm not a note taker, so actually I don't have many notes about tonight, but I think one key aspect, I think, for the people working in the field and engaging states and non-state actors about this, first of all, we have to be prepared in terms of the knowledge, of the reflexes about this topic. So if we want to convince someone to actually change their behavior, we have to be convinced about this. And in order to be convinced, we have to know what are the rules that are applicable, what are the protections that persons with disabilities have. Yeah, I think it is key that as humanitarian workers we're more prepared in this aspect in order to externalize this and to change the behavior of the parties to the conflict. In the end, what we aim is the protection of individuals in the field.
Yeah. Thank you.
What I've learned, I think, is quite simple from this evening, relearned, is the importance of inclusion, participation, representation, and to follow, as Mary and Alice and everyone's said, that instruction from people with disabilities themselves, nothing about us without us. And then doing that, let's really work with people with disabilities to generate some good examples so that when you come to do your next one in a couple of years or whatever, there are good examples, and we know what it means to do it well, and we can do it a lot better.
Thank you. Alice, last words.
Okay. Well, so my big takeaway from tonight, I think, would be similar to what Hugo said, but also just the importance of collaboration, learning from one another on this, and capacity building across the board. So the IHL sector, engaging with disability rights holders, and vice versa. Learning from one another. And also I would say, maybe I've come across as being really negative with my lack of good practices, etc. But I am positive. I am a glass half full kind of person. And I do hope this is the beginning of the conversation. I think we are going to get there. I think that we've been really encouraged by the enthusiasm for our research and for our project, and it seems to be really embraced. So there's definitely the willingness to embrace it. I think just maybe there was a little bit of an ignorance before, and now we're overcoming that.
Great. Thank you. Ending on a positive note. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll shake your hands.
So, I invite you to join us just outside of the Humanitarian here for some refreshments. And please grab a copy of Alice's excellent research report, which is also just outside.
And she is signing them.
Thank you.
This is not about prevention. I wanted to give that.